More than 18,000 Ukrainian refugees have come to Switzerland since the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. Many of them brought cash to Switzerland. But there's a problem. The Ukrainian refugees cannot convert their Ukrainian cash into Swiss francs. In other countries, such as Poland, people can exchange their Ukrainian cash into local currencies. In Switzerland, meanwhile, the Swiss National Bank has not done anything to help the refugees. Find out now what the Swiss National Bank could do, together with the government and the banks, to solve the cash conversion problem of the Ukrainian refugees.
Geldcast Update mit Fabio Canetg.
Imagine you have to flee from a war. You leave your friends behind, your family, most of your belongings. That's really something that for most of us is hardly imaginable. But there's another thing which is hardly imaginable. Many Ukrainians brought their savings to Switzerland, and they did so in cash. This cash is now essentially worthless. But not because the Ukrainian currency itself is worthless, but because Switzerland has not managed yet to solve the cash conversion issue. Let's have a closer look at this problem. Most obviously, Ukrainian refugees cannot use their cash to buy groceries. Migros and Coop just don't accept Ukrainian currency as a means of payment. But there is an even bigger issue. Banks do not accept Ukrainian cash either. In other words, banks do not convert Ukrainian cash into Swiss francs. The reason is simple. Banks wouldn't know what to do with the Ukrainian cash. In fact, at the moment, hardly anyone is willing to accept Ukrainian cash. In addition, there's a high probability that the Ukrainian currency will lose quite a bit of worth in the upcoming months and years. That is what usually happens when a country spends a lot of money for a war, just like the Ukraine is doing at the moment. There is, in principle, a buyer of last resort, and that's the Ukrainian central bank. That means banks could, in fact, exchange Ukrainian cash for Swiss francs. After deconversion, they could sell the Ukrainian cash to the Ukrainian central bank. But here's the thing, you would literally need to rent a truck that would bring the Ukrainian cash from Zurich Paradeplatz to Kiev in order to exchange the Ukrainian cash at the Ukrainian central bank into dollars or euros. That wouldn't be a problem in normal times, but we all know times are far from normal at the moment. Banks wouldn't be willing to risk sending a truck full of Ukrainian cash over the border to Kiev. But there's an even bigger issue. The Ukrainian central bank does not convert its own currency into dollars or euros at the moment. This is so because the central bank tries to spend as little as possible of its foreign currency reserves. Ukraine needs these reserves to buy much more important things, for example food or medicine or even weapons. In short, banks do not convert Ukrainian cash into Swiss francs because they would have to hold on to the Ukrainian cash. They would have to bear the exchange rate risk related to the Ukrainian currency. And banks do not want to bear this risk. Of course, the unwillingness of Swiss banks to convert Ukrainian cash into Swiss francs is quite a bit of a problem for the Ukrainian refugees in Switzerland. They fled Ukraine and essentially the only thing they brought was their cash. It's important to mention they brought cash which still has some worth inside of Ukraine, but in Switzerland at the moment it is worthless. The Swiss National Bank could solve that problem together with the government and the banks. There are two ways in which it could facilitate the cash conversion, and I want to discuss them now. Proposal 1. The Swiss National Bank could encourage banks to convert Ukrainian cash into Swiss francs by promising to buying the Ukrainian cash from the banks after the conversion. Essentially, that would mean that the Swiss National Bank would take on the exchange rate risk. Most likely, this would result in losses for the Swiss National Bank. And losses, that's something that central banks do not like, and the Swiss National Bank is no exception. But there's an easy fix. The government, that is, the taxpayer, could cover potential losses that the Swiss National Bank would make on Ukrainian cash reserves. Proposal 2. The government could set up something like a government-sponsored entity. Let's call it the Ukrainian Fund. The government would give that fund Swiss francs. The fund could use these Swiss francs to buy Ukrainian cash from the Ukrainian refugees. In order to keep things as simple as possible, banks would still be the ones exchanging Ukrainian cash into Swiss francs in the first step. But immediately after the conversion, the banks would sell the Ukrainian cash to the Ukrainian fund that was set up by the government. The Ukrainian fund could be run by the Swiss National Bank, much like the Swiss National Bank ran the SNB Stab Fund, which was set up to prevent the collapse of the UBS in 2008. People involved with the matter confirmed to me that there are talks between the Swiss National Bank, the government and the banks. They are trying to find a solution for the Ukrainian refugees. I also hear, however, that not all parties involved are equally aware of the severity of the problem. The Swiss National Bank, for example, said last week, and I quote, that it was not involved in trading in foreign banknotes. In other words, they do not think that they're responsible to make sure that Ukrainian refugees can convert their cash into Swiss francs. This contrasts starkly with the European Central Bank, which said that it wanted to help the Ukrainian refugees. News outlets reported in the last couple of days that the ECB is close to finding a solution for the cash conversion issue. In Switzerland, the responsible agencies wrapped themselves in silence. The Swiss National Bank said that they do not have anything to add to their remarks of last week. And the Treasury Department referred to the secretive Swiss National Bank. Let me wrap up. There are two ways in which the Swiss National Bank could facilitate the conversion of Ukrainian cash into Swiss francs. Either it could buy the Ukrainian cash indirectly from the Ukrainian people through banks. The government would cover potential losses. Or it could set up, together with the government, a Ukrainian fund, which would convert Ukrainian cash into Swiss francs. If you like this show, please share it on social media. This helps other people interested in monetary policy finding this show. Thanks for tuning in.
Geldcast Update mit Fabio Canetg.